The following program is for informational and educational purposes only. This program does not replace medical, mental health, or psychological diagnosis and treatment prescribed by your personal physician, psychologist, therapist, or other healthcare provider. Please consult your provider for diagnosis and care before beginning or changing any program or idea discussed.
Welcome to Psych Up Live with your host, Dr. Suzanne Phillips. This is the show that brings you a psychological perspective on common and current life issues. Here is Dr. Suzanne Phillips.
Welcome. I'm Suzanne Phillips. Thanks for joining me again on Psych Up Live. When a parent of a child with an eating disorder contacts a pediatrician or psychotherapist, they are almost always in crisis. The child may be gaining weight without explanation, dropping weight too quickly. Essentially, the child's relationship to their body has become conflicted, secretive, or compulsive. Most often, the family is full of tension, holding questions they're unsure of expressing. Today, we have some answers. Our guest is Dr. Tom Wooldridge, and he returns to Psych Up Live with a very important new book, End the Food Fight, Replacing Control with Connection to Help Your Child Heal from an Eating Disorder. This is a book that does not assign blame, but rather informs and invites parents to discover new ways of responding that foster healing. Dr. Wooldridge is a true expert in the field. He's a tenured professor and founding dean of the School of Psychology at Golden Gate University. He's a board-certified clinical psychologist, certified psychoanalyst, and certified eating disorders specialist consultant. He's licensed both in California and New York. He has authored 6 books and published more than 25 peer-reviewed articles. He serves on the editorial boards of both the Journal of the American Psychological Association and Eating Disorders, the Journal of Treatment and Prevention. He sits on the Scientific Advisory Council of the National Eating Disorders Association. Tom has received the Outstanding Research Award twice and the Judith Browning Outstanding Teacher Award. Dr. Tom Wooldridge, it is my privilege to welcome you back to Psych Up Live.
Well, thank you so much. It's really good to see you again, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about the book.
Now, you have some really earlier books that are wonderful. What prompted you to write this book?
You know, it's an interesting question because there are usually so many threads that come together to lead a person to write a book or to produce any kind of creative product. And I was thinking about that question before we started. I think it really goes back to my first experiences with patients with eating disorders, which were while I was in graduate school, and just feeling so, moved by the struggles of those families and the young people that were, with anorexia or bulimia. At that time, my training was really in sort of brief behavioral approaches, which I found to be quite powerful in helping people eat again, but maybe less effective in getting to the sort of deeper issue disorder in the first place. And so that really led me to pursue psychoanalytic training because I wanted to understand in a deeper way, what was driving these symptoms and how we could be most helpful. And part of the history of psychoanalysis in relation to eating disorders is that the early treatment approaches could be, I think quite insightful, but also quite stigmatizing. And they tended to locate a lot of the blame in the parents. They would see relational factors in the families as really causative without thinking about other things, culture, genetics, trauma unrelated to the family, the whole sort of biopsychosocial storm that comes together to create an eating disorder. And so part of what I wanted to do with this book is to try to take the best of what psychoanalytic theory has to offer, but to counteract that problematic historical stigma, to see that, in almost all cases, families are the best resource that a child has available in the process of their recovery. The parents can, in my experience as a clinician, really make all the difference. And so that's part of what I'm trying to convey in this book is that you can be, an incredible resource for your child. And setting aside, blame and stigma, how can we help you to bring forward your strengths to help their child on the road to recovery?
Mm. And I really think you capture the power of a parent as a compassionate presence. Um, you capture the idea that those of us who are therapists, at times we have been sitting with someone who's in excruciating pain. They can't tell us about it. But there's something about the way we feel that sometimes becomes a window into what they may be feeling. And one of the things you are over and over, you keep inviting the parents to do is somehow contain their hysteria or their tremendous fear that their child is going to die or their child is going to be hospitalized and nothing is going to ever happen, is that they overlook the power of their presence to just be with the child who really doesn't have the words yet. And so I really think
Yeah.
in that sense, you talk about, maybe you can explain it even a little bit better, communication through action.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot there to unpack. Let me see if I can take it, one point at a time. So the subtitle of the book, right, is Replacing Control with Connection. And I think you said it well. When a child has an eating disorder, when a family comes to treatment, the parents are terrified. I mean, of course they are, right? I mean, they're worried about their child. They're worried, about the disruptions in development that an eating disorder can cause, about the suffering their child is going through. In many cases, they're even worried that their child could die. So, the kind of terror that a parent is going to feel in that situation is, difficult to imagine, very difficult to imagine. And so, that would be the first thing I would say is that, that kind of feeling, the intensity of that kind of feeling, I think is completely understandable. The book really frames one of the central, strengths, central assets that a parent can offer to their child as the parent's own presence, the parent's own capacity for connection. And to really connect with another person, you have to first be emotionally regulated yourself, right? You have to
Mhm.
first be in a place where you're calm and warm and emotionally available. And nobody is going to be able to do that 100% of the time, right? That's really just not a human possibility. So I just want to say that right up front. There's no way in which we're trying to set up some kind of impossible standard
Right.
so that you then feel that you're always falling short. But the closer you can get to being able to provide that warmth, connection, attunement, availability, the more you'll be able to offer your child. And so that foundation of self-regulation, I think, is really, really important. How do you get that? I mean, there are many ways. You need to have your own supports in place. You need to have your own practices, your own relationships, the whole range of things that you can bring to bear on getting yourself to a kind of grounded, compassionate place. That's really, really key. So that'd be
Mm.
the first thing I'd say. You asked about the idea of communication, through action. So we can sort of build towards that. I think, a sort of central idea, right, is that person who has an eating disorder, the eating disorder means something. It is a kind of emotional communication. It's a way of trying to express an internal experience that the child or the adolescent is having. So if a person is, not eating, if they're restricting, if they're starving, that's in some way conveying what's happening inside them. And we really want to hold it in that way because that then allows the relationship to provide a kind of emotional container. If the parent can be with the child and be in a state of mind where they're thinking, what's my child going through? What's happening inside them right now? What are they trying to convey by, refusing to eat dinner tonight? Then you're in a place of emotional attunement. You're trying to connect with what's happening inside the child. Now, I'm not saying that's a cure or a panacea or anything like that. But what I am saying is that it's a way of relating to another person that has a real potential, I think, to support them as they move through the kind of journey of treatment. This book is really not intended to be a treatment approach. It's intended to kind of live alongside whatever treatment is being conducted. So,
Mhm.
if a child is in a kind of family-based treatment or, a cognitive behavioral treatment, this book would work alongside that and help the parent find the kind of optimal stance for being with their child.
Mm. So one of the things that fits with that is the notion that the child does not have the words often to say why he's binging. And so let's take a kid who doesn't have the words to say why he's binging, and we have a parent, doesn't make it a dad, who is so frightened that his fear translates in is really a cover for his anxiety. And what covers that then is anger with the kid. So now we have a kid who may not really understand why he's binging and hiding crazy foods, and a dad who's so dysregulated and loves this kid so much that he cannot regulate his own anxiety, so he's going to start yelling. So one of the problems with parents and a child who they fear is wasting away or binging in an unhealthy way is A, what are they doing wrong? They're thinking to themselves. B, why can't you just listen? And it's because we don't have the words. The parents don't have the words, the kids don't have the words. So the whole idea of the connections makes sense to me in terms of, well, we're really all together in this. We don't understand it. We're trying to follow what your therapist said. We're trying to follow what the doctor said, but it's hard for you. It's confusing for us too. But at least let's be together on this. Now, it's very easy for me to say that, but if it was my granddaughter who decided to stop eating, I wouldn't be so calm. So that's why this is a book for parents, because you do such a good job of trying to tell them what they're seeing and what they may be missing in what they're seeing.
Yeah, I
So,
loved your question. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
well, what do you think if once we get the child to feel a little comfortable? Um, I'm inclined to say it's not going to happen that on a Tuesday they finally say, well, Mom, this is really it. I'm not sure about my gender identity. I don't know if I want to be female. So as a result, I don't want to gain any weight. I want to be so we don't that's not likely. The child doesn't have a novel written about what this is about. They are as bewildered as the parents. So what we think, and don't we think this in therapy, when someone feels connection, they feel safer. If you feel safe, the chances of you cognitively functioning and thinking has improved. That's very different than if you are terrified that if your father comes in, he's going to start screaming again, or your mother's going to start crying and getting hysterical. So, I mean, our hearts are going out to the parents because this is very frightening, but they actually have more power, is what you're implying, than they realized. How do they
Yeah. Yeah.
access
I think,
that? Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. Power and potential. I think that's
yeah.
exactly right. I think the first pillar of the book, as I said, is this idea of self-regulation, right? You've got to first, and it's an ongoing process, you've got to first find a way to get yourself to a grounded, calm, warm place. And, you in asking the question, you did a lot of the work. It was interesting to hear how you sort of stated the question because you did a lot of the work that I think we want to help parents learn to do. So, another pillar in the book is this idea of reflection, right? What's required to bring online your own capacity to reflect, to think, to consider possibilities? So, you said you've got a father who's screaming in the kind of fictional example you're giving. And that screaming, that yelling, that anger, maybe it's covering over fear. So right there, that's a kind of reflective act. Okay, so I'm feeling really angry right now. I'm mad. I wonder what might be underneath the anger. That's reflective capacity. Okay, maybe there's fear underneath the anger. And what's the fear about? Well, maybe it's kind of connected to kind of anxious experience. I'm worried. I'm worried. Is my child going to get sicker? Are they going to die? That's what's driving the anger. The anger feels a little more, defended or hardened or in control. Feels a little safer than the fear. So how do we help parents start to, develop that reflective capacity, both about themselves and about their child, right? So much of the literature on secure attachment is about this. The technical word is mentalization. if a parent can hold themselves in mind and hold their child in mind, really not just themselves, but their own mind, if they can hold their own mind in mind and their child's mind in mind, then that is very promoting of security and safety, secure attachment. And as you said, I think it's exactly right. The more you can create that kind of emotional atmosphere, the better the chances that the child will be able to a place where they can start to put words to what they're really experiencing. Because I think, as you said, the words are not there at the beginning. They're starving, or they're binging, or they're doing some other kind of eating behavior. Very rarely do you meet somebody in that place who can give you a kind of in-depth, coherent description of why they're doing what they're doing. They're just doing it. It feels bad. Maybe it helps them feel a little better, but they couldn't really tell you how. Not yet.
There's one example in the book that really was moving to me. I think it's a girl at the table. She's not eating anything. And the mother is thinking, the doctor said if she doesn't eat, she's going to be hospitalized. The psychologist said we will have to increase the medication. So this mother takes the position that I guess we're advocating. The girl goes to her room, and the mother just goes in the room and sits down on the floor next to her bed and doesn't say a thing. And after, let's say, an hour or so, the little girl says, thanks for staying with me, Mom. The mother really has done nothing profoundly brilliant. All she knows is, well, the only thing I know how to do is be next to her. And I think that's a very important key to what you're suggesting is, as parents, rather than feeling like you're failing, remember your power of holding a baby. Remember your power of when your kid sees you in the kindergarten play and starts waving, because that's your presence. So your presence is so powerful. And I think we're saying, harness that. We would be ridiculous if we said, don't be anxious. But it struck me that that mother got a really important message from the girl who said, thanks for staying with me, because it means they're alone in this. Now, I'm not going to ignore the fact that sometimes they are brutally negative, the kids, and they can be what I'll call obnoxious. But remember, it would be as if someone had a wound and nobody was tending to it, but they were saying, don't touch me. So it's not an easy thing. It's probably good if parents can work together, but we know that sometimes is only in the sitcoms and may not be true, in a family. But everybody brings something to the table, and maybe the parents bring very good things, but very different things. Like maybe the kid will hit tennis balls with the dad, but he's not going to talk about eating disorders. Well, then hitting those tennis balls, it seems to me, are a very important part of the story.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very well said. I mean, this idea of presence, I think, is just so so important. I mean, it makes me think again about this self-regulation piece. The mom that can go into the room and sit by the bed. I'm not at all saying that sometimes it is true. Sometimes parents have to use their authority and make hard decisions. Tonight we're going to sit down at the table and we're going to finish the meal. Just like we practiced in family therapy, that's what's happening tonight. There's absolutely a place for that.
Yes.
I think the thing I'm trying to get at, though, with that example is, what is the emotional state that you use your authority from? So if you're in a place of anxiety and urgency and aggression, that's less likely to be effective than if you're in a place that's grounded and calm and connected. Even urgency, right? I mean, of course, there's urgency when a child has an eating disorder. You want to resolve it as quick as possible. But when you're in that emotional state of urgency, that is a kind of dysregulation. It is a kind of anxiety. And, I think the thing we know from, 100 years of psychoanalysis, but also more recently, all the research in affective neuroscience, is that anxiety is contagious. When a parent is in a place that's urgent and anxious and pressured, there is a kind of nonverbal communication channel between parent and child the child feels that. And so, the child is going to react to it in one way or another, sometimes by, say, digging in their heels a little more. So, how do you get out of that place of urgency, of anxiety, of aggression? There are so many different ways. You have to recognize that you're in it. And that's the reflective piece. Can you keep track of your own mind and the place that you're in and how that's then shaping the interaction that you're having? That's the challenge.
And so, what would be a first step toward doing that or developing that skill, Tom?
I think just asking yourself the question, from a place of genuine curiosity, not a place of internal aggression, like let me, you know, um, get rid of whatever I'm feeling and be in a different place. It's not so much that. It's more just noticing, where am I right now? What's coming up for me? How do I feel in my body? What's the state of mind that I'm in? Am I kind of calm and grounded and connected? And calm, grounded, connected, warm, that's the compass. You want to always be working to move in that direction. Or am I, anxious or afraid, irritated, or, something else? Not that any of those feelings are wrong, but if you can just notice them, if you can just start there and notice them, then you're in a better position to start to make choices that orient you more towards connection and warmth and groundedness.
So, I'll be a parent for a minute. How do I tolerate my panic when the doctor tells me she's lost too much weight? Now we're going to start thinking about hospitalization. Where do I go with that? Now I feel kind of caught. I can't force her to eat. She won't. He's saying she's become too thin. Where is my psychological place as parent in that between those two forces?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is not an easy situation, right? So, of course, you're going to feel panic in the moment when that news is delivered. There's no, I mean, it's very hard for me to imagine a loving, caring parent who's not going to feel panicked when they hear that news
Mm-hmm.
and who is going to, feel panicked again and again, as they confront it and think about it and reflect on it. It's very anxiety provoking. So, it's no way in which I mean to be saying, you need to be calm and grounded and loving in that moment. But can you notice that you're panicked? Can you sort of talk to yourself about it? Like, okay, yeah, this is terrifying for me. I'm really, really scared. Can you first just notice and acknowledge that as a truth? And then from there, can you start to make decisions that help you get to a grounded place as much as you can? It's never going to be perfect, right? But, if I'm just imagining a kind of, fictional parent who's just learned, okay, if my daughter doesn't start eating really, really soon, we're headed to a higher level of care. Well, okay, what do you need to resource yourself? Can you call a friend? Can you talk to a partner? Do you have your own therapist? Maybe you can get on the phone with them. Do you have a meditation practice or a church or exercise or whatever it is for you? What's going to help you get back to baseline, however imperfectly? It's because it's not going to be perfect. But the first thing you have to do is know that you're in that anxious, fearful, terrified state. If you can't name it, if you can't see it, then it's much more likely to kind of play out on automatic pilot. And when it just plays out unconsciously or on automatic pilot, then it's much more likely to create harm, and create, further rupture.
Well, I like what you're saying because in some ways we could translate it to, okay, I have to be the healthiest and self-aware person that I can be so that as my daughter comes out of that hospitalization or as she's back home, I'm I'm okay and we'll be able to say we did it. But I mean, it's self-care. What you're saying is don't overlook self-care as a primary factor in a child's health because children don't miss much. Teens don't miss anything. So if you're coming in hysterical and anxious, the kid, wherever they happen to be, is going to feel something must be terrible. something very bad's going to happen to me. What's going to happen
Yeah.
with me if my... So it's very related. The parents' feelings and their ability, as you say, to use and develop resilience of any kind is actually a gift to the kids. Kids notice. Kids notice when parents are sad, mad, and they also notice when parents all of a sudden start feeling better about themselves. So I think
Yeah,
it's
I think you're
really,
right.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, yeah. Well, I was just thinking, I was just on an airplane yesterday, and there's the thing where the flight attendant says, put on your own oxygen mask before you put the mask on your child.
Oh, it's a
And
good
I
analogy.
think
Yeah.
it's a good analogy. It's a good
Yeah.
metaphor. It sounds so obvious, as I say it, but I think, it's still quite powerful. I mean, to be able to sort of model that, to get to a place of groundedness yourself. And then, I really want to highlight the aspect of reflection, because that grounded place, it allows you to do something that you can't do when you're in an anxious or a kind of fight, flight, or freeze state. It allows you to really think about the mind of your child and to really get curious about what's going on inside them. Not because you're trying to get to some kind of, final insight. It's much more about the process of curiosity. Because if you can be curious about your child, it may be that then they can start to be curious about themselves too. If you can start to think, okay, they had another binge last night. I wonder what was going on with them. What kind of day did they have? What's going on with their friends? What's going on in their mind? If you can start to bring that, not as a kind of interrogation, or certainly not as some kind of, all knowing interpretation, but as a kind of curiosity, then they may start to pick that up too.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I believe that that's really what's needed. It's not a panacea, but you really want to be in a place of curiosity about your own internal experience.
Well, what that leads me back to is an important theme, I think, of yours, which is when we think about children with eating disorders, you're saying you want to underscore this is communication through action, that in some way
Yes,
they are communicating by means of this disorder because
exactly, exactly.
they they don't have the words.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a key point, that we really want to think about the symptoms that our kids are struggling with as communications. And I'm not at all saying if you decode the communication, then the problem goes away.
Right.
It may be that other things are needed. It's just that, to have a kind of productive relationship to one's own mind, we have to think of our behaviors as meaningful.
Okay. We just got the signal that we have to take a break. We're going to take a break. You've been listening to Psych Up Live. I'm here with Dr. Tom Wooldridge, his new book, End the Food Fight, Replacing Control with Connection to Help Your Child Heal from an Eating Disorder. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
are listening to Psych Up Live. Join in our conversation today. Send an email to radiohostphillips@gmail.com. Now, back to Psych Up Live.
Welcome back, folks. We're here with Dr. Tom Wooldridge. He's discussing his new and very important book, End the Food Fight, Replacing Control with Connection to Help Your Child Heal from an Eating Disorder. We've been talking about some really important things, and we were just focusing a bit on the parental presence, and that this is not an easy thing in terms of, expand it for me, Tom, or correct me, the parental presence of a child who is binging, hiding food, refusing to eat completely, not talking, involves a parent being able to tolerate silence and anxiety. And you spoke a little bit about parents developing skills to deal with that themselves, because there's not a parent in the world who wouldn't be anxious with a child who is suffering like this. And you say reconnection with your child, because sometimes it's become so difficult. The kid doesn't want to speak to you. You can barely want to speak to the child. It gets very painful. You say reconnection happens through consistent, attuned presence, which takes building safety one moment at a time. Maybe you could give us an example of that.
Yeah, yeah. I like this metaphor of, an emotional atmosphere. What's the emotional atmosphere in the family? And I think that's a question that you can, start by asking yourself as a parent. Is there fear? Is there pressure? Is there anxiety? Or is there a feeling of sort of safety and warmth and connection, or, something in between, or both? But this idea of an atmosphere, you're trying to cultivate a certain kind of atmosphere, which takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes, a kind of building of a skill of regulation in yourself. You're the kind of, the parent is a kind of emotional thermostat in the family, right? I mean, I like that idea because, the place that you're in, if you're grounded, if you're calm, if you're warm, it'll have a kind of ripple effect throughout the whole atmosphere of the family. It'll help everyone calm down. And conversely, if you're upset and anxious and pressured, that will also have a kind of ripple effect throughout the family. And so, how do you do that? Well, it's very hard. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I think as parents, we all fall short, again and again. So we always have to be on the lookout for setting up kind of impossible ideals that we're not going to be able to live up to. It's much more about charting a certain direction, always trying to move in a certain direction and knowing that we'll fall short. So in the example, the parent goes to the child, and it's true, when children have eating disorders, or even when they don't, often we have to be with them when they're in a difficult place, when they don't have words for what they're struggling with. So there's silence. Maybe there's even hostility. Can you be with that? Can you sort of stay present to that without trying to fix it? Without trying to fix it, I think is really, really important, because, of course, if a child has an eating disorder, we want to fix it. If we could wave a magic wand and fix it, of course we do that. But we don't have a magic wand. And often when we move forward in a pressured way, the interaction becomes polarizing, right? If you approach somebody and try to fix them, as often as not, they'll just oppose you. They'll take up the other position and dig their heels in. So, again, I'm not saying we never have to use our authority. Of course we do. But what would it mean to experiment with just, kind of being with a person without trying to fix them, even for a little while, for a few moments? What kind of atmosphere does that start to create? I think that's part of the question I'm asking.
When you said that, it made me think of patients who have said to me, I'm tired of being the identified patient in the family. I'm more than just that. And so it's understandable when someone has a serious illness or a serious condition like that, that's what everyone's riveted on. But I think given connection is so important, and we're talking about it as a particularly important aspect of healing eating disorders, that let's not lose sight of the fact that your daughter also is an unbelievable artist, or that your son really is ridiculous at golf. So let's not lose sight of what else they own, in this little world of theirs, or this emerging world of theirs, so that it's not an invitation to ignore the eating disorder, but let's not just make them an eating disorder. Let's make them Jake, who probably could play most of dad's golf friends, and he also is suffering from something else. Now, sometimes everything falls apart for a kid, but it may not. Not if we keep our eyes on whatever particular shows they like, books they've read, if there's something that they're good at. Sometimes you start with the celebration. And when you have enough resilience in the relationship, you can start saying, now, how can we get this to help us with that? Or how can I be with you with this as well as when we love playing tennis together? So that I think you can. I mean, this happens so much to kids. Sometimes they're the athlete. No one knows what anything else is about them. No one realizes they also write poetry, or that at the moment they're very upset because they're being bullied in school. So it's the multidimensional qualities of teens need to be celebrated, even as we're going through this journey with the eating disorder.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's so well said. I don't know if that's something that I take up in the book directly or not, but it's a really important point. The risk of a child, it's not the only risk, but one of the risks, right, of a child sort of struggling with food or eating or issues related to their body is that, it can really become a kind of totalizing identity. I
Yes,
am a
yeah,
person who is thin, or I am a person who has a lot of muscles, and as that sort of sucks away more and more energy from everything else, it can become a kind of whole identity. And so, as parents, when we relate to our children, we have this advantage, which is that we've known them their whole lives, right? We can hold the kind of totality of who they are, including their history and the various interests they've had at different points in their development. We can hold a much broader perspective in our way of relating to them. And it may be, especially with teenagers, that we're one of the few people in their lives that can actually do that.
yes,
Peer
yes.
culture can become so narrow in some of its forms. And so we really, I think, have something tremendous to offer children with that larger perspective on who they are and who they can be.
Well, what makes me think about this is it's funny working with elderly people who say, when did I just become my diagnosis? There's a lot of the rest of me still ready to take on life. But every time I get treated, I feel like I'm just my diagnosis. And we don't want that to happen here, in some
Right,
way.
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we don't want the parents to get so locked into it that they forget maybe even joyful things that they did with the kids. It's not, I want to underscore, as you have, it is not easy to parent the children when they're suffering with an eating disorder. Um,
Yeah.
it's difficult. It's very difficult. So, you can think you're creative and they won't even stay in the room with you. You could make the foods they love and they won't eat it. Um, but in some ways, as you're saying, to stay present with yourself and to keep believing in the power of your presence with your child, no matter how good or bad that day is, seems to be something that's an important bridge to help.
I think so. I mean, it is a kind of faith in a way, that you have something through your relationship with your child, you have something to offer them, that your presence can have a kind of healing impact. And, I just want to reiterate again and again that this is not intended to be a complete treatment approach, right? I mean,
Right, right.
if your child has an eating disorder, they need a treatment team. They need professionals. They need a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a nutritionist, an eating disorders informed pediatrician. And it's very important to put together a treatment team to, pursue the kind of treatment that you feel is the best fit for your child and their family, to look at the evidence, to look at the experience of the treatment providers, and to put that together, as the best possible support for your child and your family. This book is really intended to give you, the parent, a kind of map of the territory emotionally. How are you going to stay? Because, if you work with families, you see that parents burn out. It's very, very common for parents to burn out as they sort of move through this process because it is so emotionally demanding. The other thing that can happen is that, parents they move into a kind of automatic pilot. They're so anxious, they're so terrified that they just start to go through the kind of checklists. All right, we have this appointment, then this appointment, here's the plan, let's do this, let's do that. And there's no kind of checking in with oneself. Where am I emotionally? Because, as you follow the plan, there's still a kind of emotional atmosphere that you're doing the plan from. You're doing the plan from whatever emotional place you're in. And I would say that, you can have a perfectly good plan, but if you do it in an anxious, pressured, driven way, you may actually undermine a lot of what the plan has to offer. And so this book is really intended to kind of help you lay the foundation to then do whatever kind of treatment you've decided to pursue.
Hmm. I'm going to list the 4-step parent reset. But before I do that, just as a sidebar, Tom, if I'm a parent who's just newly facing dealing with my child with an eating disorder, you talked about putting together a team. Where would I go? Who would be my first call in terms of the team you just described?
I would say for most people, you start with the family pediatrician.
Okay.
That's usually a place to start. I think the other thing that you could do is you can make contact with a psychotherapist who specializes in eating disorders, just to have an initial conversation to kind of lay out the picture of what's happening, and then to get guidance from them about what the next steps would be. I think it's really important though to find somebody who has specialized training or even a specialized certification or experience with people with eating disorders, because there's a whole range of backgrounds and training and experience, and you really want somebody who's sort of seen this before, knows the terrain, is less likely to kind of, especially if you have a child that it's very early stages, it's not severe, but you're hoping to catch it early. You really want to speak with somebody who's much more likely to take your concerns seriously, especially with certain populations, like say men with anorexia, for example. If it's not an extreme case, it's not uncommon for treatment providers to take it a little bit less seriously because the disorder has been associated with females
Right. Yeah.
historically.
Yeah. Okay, that's terrific. So you given we're all human, and at some point you're going to catch yourself in a moment of like explosion or just too much stress, you give us a 4-step parent reset. The first is pause, catch yourself in the moment, feel the stress mounting. Then, and this is a little bit what you were talking about, see if you could name what is happening in you. I'm frustrated. By doing that, by naming the emotional charge, that helps us reflect on it. Then the third is you wonder what might be happening in your child, in terms of are they lying to protect themselves? Are they not eating because they're angry with you? Whatever that happens to be, wonder about what might be happening. And the fourth is choose how to respond. Choose to wait. It may be an important thing to do and not jump in and react. But I felt like those 4 steps, you call them the parent reset.
Yeah, yeah. I think those 4 steps are really meant to kind of codify, some of the core ideas in the book. So the first
Hmm.
is to really just pause, slow down. Part of what you can pay attention to, I think, around this question of, are you in a regulated place? Are you not in a regulated place? Is what does it feel like to pause? In any moment in life when it's hard to pause, you're usually in the grip of some kind of
Right.
urgency or energy, right? So what does it mean to just stop for a minute? What does that feel like? That's a way to check in with yourself,
Yeah,
right?
good.
So even just starting there, I think is a good thing to play around with. And then, can you name what's happening? Can you just put words to it? Because if you can put words to it, then you can start to do the third step, which is to really reflect
Yeah,
on it.
yeah.
You know, Okay, so there's irritation. What's that about? And the attitude is not to get rid of the irritation. It's just to notice it and wonder about it. What does it mean? Am I irritated because I only got 5 hours of sleep last night, or because I had a fight with my husband early this morning? Or is it sort of a way of you know fear and anxiety is sort of showing up for me? But just to kind of name it, and then wonder about it. Get curious. I had a
Hmm.
wonderful supervisor in graduate school who would always say, get curious about your inner life and the inner life of other people. Kind of humble sort of questioning. That's what we want to try to embody. And I think once we can get to that place, we've paused, we've sort of put words to what's happening, we've checked in with ourselves with a kind of curiosity, then we're in a much better space to approach our child. That's what it means to approach them from a kind of grounded place.
Hmm. Hmm. Would you say that the parents as a couple should do that also with each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a lovely way to approach another person, whether it's in a marriage or a parent-child relationship, or, really almost any context. I think an interaction is likely to go better if you're able to approach it from a kind of curious, warm, regulated, grounded place. And, I don't know that there's any book that's been written about this, or even if there's any research literature about it, but for sure, clinically, you see it all the time. When parents, when say, a married couple have a child with an eating disorder, very commonly it drives conflict between the two
Mhm.
parents.
Yeah,
How
yeah,
can it
yeah.
not? Because both people are terrified, they're wanting to fix it, they're wanting to do something. And so it's, very easy for parents to become polarized. One parent says you have to push, another one says you have to back off, or
Mm.
one parent says you're we need more limits. The other parent says, oh, we need to back off and give him space.
Mhm.
These kinds of polarizations are very, very common. And part of what you're wanting to do, and part of what family therapists try to help parents do, is stay on the same team, right? The more you can be on the same team, not in a kind of authoritarian way, but in a kind of, we're in this together. We have to collaborate. That's the word I'm looking
Yes,
for.
yes, yeah,
Collaborate.
yeah.
That's the stance you want to be in as a family.
Right. It's in the work that I've done with couples after trauma. That's the whole point. And that is if we don't have to agree on everything, but if we pull together our resilience, we have a better chance of dealing with the loss, the difficulty, the illness, whatever it happens to be. And
Yeah.
you're using such a sort of psychological approach here that I think is so really important. Um, what a, what would you say in terms of the parents having um, different approaches with the children? And the other question I have is, some people feel like if there's something wrong with their child, like an eating disorder, no one's allowed to tell anyone outside the family. So now we have added to the rest of the children in the family a secret that they can't disclose. Or we've added a secret to the spouses. That means he can't at work say, I'm so worried about my daughter, or she's not supposed to tell her book group friends about the kids. Now, you can't stop women, they're going to do it anyway. But I've worked with men who were told they couldn't tell their buddies that their wife had breast cancer, for instance. The man couldn't handle it. He really felt he was carrying something that he had to share. We say when you share something, it gets lighter, and when it comes to, I'm not saying tell your whole neighborhood, but if you have some trusted friends, sometimes you're surprised that a trusted friend has a professional or knows someone who knows about a good program, so that you don't have to, there doesn't have to be shame with this. There is pain with it, but it doesn't have to be shame. It's like when people get a diagnosis, they don't want to tell anyone because it's as if they gave themselves the illness. So, that's the other piece that sometimes impacts the parent's ability to stay calm and to take it one day at a time, and to follow, of course, the program that their child's in, or the doctors that they're working with. But guilt and shame don't help anybody in the situation. But it's sort of human, but it's worth saying, some kids get sick with some things, some family members get sick with something else. This is truly a disorder that children suffer with. They didn't bring it on themselves. So
Yeah.
the more that we can put this in a different perspective, I think the family as well as the children.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it's absolutely something I would want for us to spend some time on. This question of guilt and shame, I think, is a really important one. I make a lot of attempts to say, both in this conversation and also in the book, that the book is really not intended to in any way blame parents. Eating disorders are
Right,
very complicated. And I think of it as a kind of biopsychosocial storm, right? There are biological components, metabolic and genetic. For sure, there's sociocultural factors, at play, huge for both boys and girls. And then there are relational things that happen inside families and outside of them, and also intergenerational factors that are at play. So it's all very, very complicated, and it's usually more than one thing that comes together. It's very common, I think, for parents to feel guilt and shame, right? I mean, that is
yes,
almost a universal experience for those
right,
feelings to be there.
right,
And I think you're right to point out that, guilt and shame can then drive secrecy. And secrets, bring their own sets of problems, right? I mean, when you make something a secret, it starts to develop a kind of energy. It starts to, a secret can exert an effect on the whole family, a really kind of profound
right,
effect.
right.
And so we have to be very sort of mindful and attentive to the truth of that.
Mhm,
Now,
mhm.
I think the thing I would say about guilt and shame is that we want to apply the same process to those feelings that we do to all the other feelings. The same process that's outlined in the book, which is to really, first of all, notice it and name it. If there's guilt and shame, can you be aware that that's what you're feeling? Okay, I feel a lot of guilt about what my son or daughter is going through, or I feel very ashamed, with what's happening in my family. So can you notice it and name it? And then can you get curious about it? Okay, well, what am I guilty about? Do I feel like, I did this to my son? Something about, just to make up an example, my own issues with food and eating, somehow I've transmitted them to my child, and I feel so guilty and so ashamed of that.
Mm. I'm going to apologize because we're just about out of time, but the whole
Yeah.
position that you're taking is one that I hope people can embrace, to know that, as professionals, we're concerned. It's not about blame, it's about hope and it's about connection. Um, can you give our listeners a very brief take-home message?
Yeah, I think the take home message is that you are a tremendous resource for your child. That your presence, your psychological and emotional capacity to be regulated and curious, it's not a panacea, but it is a tremendous resource. And so I'd want listeners to come away with a sense of that, and
It's true.
hopefully some hope that if they can develop that idea in themselves, they can really offer their children something special.
Terrific. Now, how can people find your book?
My book comes out in August, so in about a month.
Okay.
It'll be, on Amazon and all the other bookstores online. I also have a website, which is www.tomwooldridge.com, and I'm also on Substack.
Okay, it'd be worth checking his website. His other books are great too. This is a man who's 22 or more periodicals. I want to thank you so much for your work all these years, your dedication, and for bringing your expertise to Psych Up Live. I want to thank my listeners. Remember, you can hear this in any of the shows on Voice America, Libsyn Media, on all the major platforms, iTunes, iHeart. Until next week, be safe, stay cool, and be listening.
Thank you for tuning in to Psych Up Live. Please join Dr. Suzanne Phillips for another edition of our programming next Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Variety Channel. Until then, be well and be listening.